Doc Holliday was nothing if not complicated. He was a drunk and a gambler, a deadly shootist, a consumptive, and quite possibly even a con artist. But at the same time, he was also an educated Southern gentleman and a graduate of dental school. He was liked by some, hated by many, and feared by, well, pretty much everybody. And despite dying at just 36 years of age, Holliday lived long enough to become a frontier legend, one that has since become almost synonymous with the Old West. But who was Doc Holliday, really? How'd such an educated man find himself in dusty outposts like Fort Griffin and Dodge City? How'd a drunken killer become best friends with a respected lawman like Wyatt Earp? And what exactly was it that caused Doc to head west in the first place? Was it unrequited love? Was it due to being diagnosed with tuberculosis? Or was he running from the law after gunning down a pair of freed slaves? And did he really stab Ed Bailey like they show in the movie Tombstone? Join me today as we discuss all of this and more, including Doc's childhood, his relationship with Big Nose Kate, and the very first time he ever met the aforementioned Wyatt Earp. Feels good to be back. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza.
Yeehaw!
John Henry Holliday was born in Fort Griffin, Georgia on August 14th, 1851. His father, Henry Burroughs Holliday, was a druggist by trade who, just a few years prior, had fought in Mexico under General Taylor. And upon returning home, he brought with him a young Hispanic boy who had been orphaned by the war. Henry adopted the kid to raise as his own, and not long after is when he got married to a Miss Alice Jane McKee, daughter of a well-to-do plantation owner. The pair would welcome their first child the following December, a girl they named Martha, but sadly she wouldn't make it past her first 6 months. And then, of course, just a little over a year later is when Alice gave birth to John Henry. Now, I did find at least one source claiming they had a total of 6 children, all of whom died in infancy other than John Henry. I'm not really sure how true that is, but either way, John, or Doc, as he would soon come to be known, would basically grow up as an only child. He did have that adopted brother I mentioned a moment ago, Francisco, but then again, Francisco was quite a bit older, and he had already moved out on his own by the time Doc was a toddler. That said, he would be close with several of his cousins. A little too close with one of them, if you catch my drift. In fact, when Doc's maternal grandparents passed away, his father became legal guardian of his mother's younger siblings, including 14-year-old Thomas, who became sort of an older brother figure. So even though Doc never had any blood siblings of his own, at least not that lived, he certainly wasn't lacking for companionship. And for the first decade or so of his life, things were pretty decent. His father prospered financially and started buying up land, while his mother absolutely doted on him, just doing her level best to pass on her faith and instill a proper sense of manners. Sounds like a pretty structured life, but then again, young Holliday was given an extraordinary amount of freedom, just like most other boys his age there in the South, at least the white ones. Per Holliday biographer Gary Roberts, quote, "At an early age, they learned independence, took to the fields and woods, and began their tutelage in hunting, the handling of firearms, and horseback riding. Courtesy, spirit, and firmness were all part of the curriculum of individualism the Southern sons learned, but care was taken not to undermine their self-confidence or pride." End of quote. Now, speaking of self-confidence, there is some indication that Doc was possibly born with a cleft palate. And when I say some indication, this comes from just one source and one source only. The wife, one of Doc's cousins. According to her, the cleft was corrected via surgery, but Holliday remained self-conscious, withdrawn, and a mama's boy. Like I said, there's only one source on this, and from what I understand, she never actually met Doc in person, so grain of salt, right? And that's another thing. Just a very brief disclaimer before we continue, but someone complained recently that I was a little too milquetoast, their words, not mine, and that I'm always going on and on about boring stuff like evidence and corroboration. And yeah, guilty as charged. This is a history show. We discuss historical people and events, and I do strive to be as historically accurate as possible. Whether or not Doc had a cleft palate is pretty inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but this will not be the last time you hear me point out just how shaky the evidence is concerning certain aspects of his life. Doc never kept a journal, and he very rarely sat for interviews. That being the case, all we have to rely on, for the most part, are the words of others, some of whom liked and admired Holliday, and some who absolutely hated the man. Toss in rumors and sloppy reporting, and over time, the legend became so ingrained that it can be very difficult to separate fact from fiction. Just wanted to point that out. Like I said, this will not be the last time you hear me speculate on the veracity of certain events. It's not because I hate Doc Holliday or that I'm against fun or I have an agenda or anything like that. All I'm trying to do is to be as accurate as possible while hopefully being at least somewhat entertaining. Okay, so, like I was saying, while it does seem that Doc had a pretty decent childhood, this would change drastically with the onset of the Civil War. His family, who, by the way, did own slaves, would end up moving some 200 miles south to the town of Valdosta, mostly to avoid Sherman's march on Atlanta. And it's there in Valdosta, sadly, where Doc's mother would pass away from tuberculosis in September of 1866. Now, if you're not familiar, tuberculosis is an infectious disease that mostly affects the lungs. It's spread through the air via microscopic droplets, and once inhaled, it can lie dormant for years. Sometimes your body is able to sort of lock it down and you can live a somewhat normal life, at least for a while. But at other times, especially when you're worn down by stress or poor nutrition, it'll flare back up, usually in the form of a persistent cough, chest pain, fever, and exhaustion. Eventually, though, you'll wind up in bed, either from respiratory failure or organ malfunction or possibly even pneumonia due to a weakened immune system. In other words, it was not a quick death. Those who fell prey would grow weaker by the month as it slowly chewed its way through their lungs, and in some cases even spread into their bones or their brains. I didn't know this until recently, but back in the 19th century, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death here in the United States. I'm talking like 1 out of every 10 people. And the crazy part is, nobody even knew that it was infectious until the 1880s. There was some suspicion prior to that, but they really couldn't nail down how or why it was spread. Up until then, it was thought to be either hereditary or caused by hard living. Now, as traumatic as I'm sure it was for the then just 15-year-old Holliday to lose his mother, his father seemed to move on rather quickly, remarrying just 3 months later to 23-year-old Rachel Martin. A turn of events that reportedly caused Doc to become quite sullen. And yeah, I bet. Not only was he still mourning the death of his mother, but now he's got a stepmom young enough to be his sister. But hey, life goes on, right? Doc would continue his schooling right there in Valdosta at the very fancy-sounding Valdosta Institute. This is also around the same time that he first showed an inclination towards violence. Apparently, he and a classmate got into an argument and decided to settle things with a good old-fashioned duel. Kind of. It was just supposed to be a mock duel, with him and his opponent using pistols that were only charged with powder. But I guess young Doc had other plans, showing up with a fully loaded pistol, looking to play for blood. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed, and his classmate offered up what I can only assume was a very sincere apology, and that was that. Now, eventually, in the fall of 1870, Doc would head to Philadelphia to enroll in dental school, a choice likely influenced by another young man there in Valdosta who had recently done the same, as well as his physician uncle, John Stiles. Per historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, John Henry chose one of the best dental schools in the country, the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in Philadelphia, where he began his studies in September of 1870. Among the several requirements to graduate, dental students needed to complete a minimum of 2 full courses of lectures, serve an internship with a private practice, and write a thesis. End of quote. And yeah, Doc graduated just a year and a half later, at which point he got himself a job as a dentist over in Atlanta, or as I like to call it, Hotlanta. Now, that said, there are additional stories claiming that Doc initially headed to St. Louis after graduation, and it was there where he first met a young lady going by the name of Kate Fisher, also known as Big Nose Kate. Originally from Hungary, Miss Fisher, whose real name, by the way, was Mary Catherine Haroni, immigrated to the United States with her family when she was around 10 years old. Sadly, within just a few years, both of her parents were dead, and Kate was on her own. And although she'd later claimed to have attended school in St. Louis, records do indicate that she was actually working there as a prostitute as early as 1870. Now, the only source showing that Holliday was in St. Louis, or that it was there where he initially met Kate, comes from Kate herself. And while I don't think that she should be completely discounted, many of her recollections are riddled with inaccuracies. And to once again quote historian Mark Lee Gardner, to date, no contemporary evidence has surfaced documenting Holliday's presence in St. Louis in 1872. And look, I'm not going to definitively say that Doc was not in St. Louis, but we just don't have any evidence of it one way or the other than Cade, and unfortunately, she's just not that reliable of a source. We do, however, know that he went to Atlanta, just not for very long. His dental partner came down with a case of tuberculosis, his uncle Robert died, and then early on in 1873 is when his adopted brother Francisco also passed away from, you guessed it, tuberculosis. So, that being the case, Doc headed back to his old hometown of Griffin, and then from there back to Valdosta. Once again, though, just not for very long. In fact, by the summer of 1873, Holliday would be residing in the bustling metropolis of Dallas, Texas. Now, as to why Doc made such an abrupt move, we'll likely never know for certain. One of the more popular narratives is that he was diagnosed with tuberculosis and he headed west for a drier climate, or what was referred to in those days as the Western cure. I do think this is very plausible, especially considering that Doc was indeed examined by his own uncle, the physician, and diagnosed as a consumptive around the same time that he was living in Atlanta. But this may not necessarily be the only reason the Doc headed west. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to Dallas or not, but it ain't exactly the gold standard when it comes to dry air, especially in the summertime. Although not quite as humid as Georgia, Dallas does get very, very muggy, to the point that it can sometimes feel like you're breathing in water. So if Holliday really did head west for a drier climate, I'd say Dallas was a poor choice. Another possible explanation is his first cousin Maddie. Now, I haven't brought her up just yet, but Maddie was the daughter of the Uncle Robert I mentioned a moment ago. She and Doc were said to have been very, very close, to the point that many have speculated that they were romantically involved. There was just one problem, though. You see, Maddie was a devout Catholic, and canon law didn't allow marriage between first cousins. There were also rumors that the family didn't approve of the relationship. Now, we'll talk more about Maddie later on. She and Doc would actually stay in contact for pretty much the remainder of his life. But there is a third theory as to why he left Georgia. Apparently, there was this popular swimming hole just outside of Valdosta, and I guess Doc, being a son of the South, didn't much like the idea of sharing it with people of color. He tried putting the unwanted swimmers on notice, but they failed to take heed, so he came back with a shotgun. He once again told them to get gone, and when they hesitated, he opened fire, killing 2 and wounding several others. Legend has it that the local law wasn't really all that concerned, but I guess Doc's family was, and they felt like it would be a good idea for him to make himself scarce. So he headed for Dallas. But did this really happen? Well, as it turns out, there's no contemporary evidence to back it up. No newspaper accounts or legal documents or anything like that. All we have are stories, one of which was shared by Bat Masterson decades after Holliday's death. There was also a mention in one of Holliday's obituaries. Hell, even the Holliday family has stories, with some of them claiming that it's true and others saying that it was a pistol that Doc used, but that he purposely aimed high and the shot went over their heads without hurting anyone. So who knows, man? I think it's something that could have happened. It's certainly not outside the realm of possibility. But at this point, it does remain mostly uncorroborated. But yeah, it's thought by many that it was this shooting, or possibly even a combination of all of the above, his tuberculosis and the unrequited love of a cousin, that caused Doc to head west. Per Holliday biographer Gary Roberts, quote, "Perhaps the truth was some combination of all these issues. Perhaps John Henry learned he had tuberculosis, pressed Maddie for an answer, only to be turned down, returned to Valdosta, and was forced west by the shooting incident. This much is clear. Something traumatic and devastating enough to interrupt his plans drove him west that summer of 1873. Coughing spasms, a broken heart, a shotgun blast, or combination of all three, cut him off forever from his past and threw him into an unknown future." End of quote. Well said, Mr. Roberts. Now, once Doc arrived in Dallas, he partnered up with fellow dentist John Seeger, or Segar. And by all accounts, they did prosper. Hell, they even won several prizes at the state fair, including Best Set of Teeth in Gold. Dude was just 22 years old and already an award-winning dentist. But the dark side soon came a-calling. You see, although nobody can say for certain when Holliday first started gambling, it was there in Dallas where the vice became an obsession. Or as Bat Masterson would later put it, In a short time, those who wished to consult professionally with a doctor had to do so over a card table in some nearby gambling establishment, or not at all. Hell, even Holliday himself would admit, quote, "I was a member of the Methodist Church and also a prominent member of the temperance organization until I deviated from the path of rectitude." I like how he puts that. Deviated from the path of rectitude. Sounds a lot like what happened to me when I turned 18. Only instead of gambling and shootouts, I just got really into big-bootied Latinas and cheap booze. But yeah, it was likely this deviation on Holliday's part that caused him and Doc Seeger to part ways in early March 1874. And then, just a month later, is when Holliday got arrested for playing Keno. Per historian Mark Lee Gardner, quote, "This arrest, the first on record for John Henry Holliday, marked the beginning of a restless life in one western town after another, consistently running afoul of the law, and more often than not, running afoul of other humans. Doc didn't completely give up dentistry, not right away, but gambling became his passion until eventually he did nothing else." End of quote. Later on that summer, Doc spent a brief period up in Denison before heading back to Dallas. And it's there in Dallas on New Year's Eve, 1874, that he experienced his very first known gunfight. Details are sparse, but story goes he exchanged bullets with a bartender known as Champagne Charlie. And although neither man sustained wounds, they were both arrested, with Holliday being charged with assault with the intent to murder. Luckily, he was acquitted less than a month later, at which point he headed some 200 miles west to Fort Griffin. Now, Fort Griffin back in those days was about as wild as you can imagine. Originally established in 1867 to protect settlers, the fort soon became a popular stopping point for cattle herds headed north. And in time, it would even serve as sort of a hub for bison hunters. According to Fort Griffin local Don Biggers, there were, quote, "buffalo hunters, bullwhackers, soldiers, cowpunchers, Indians, gamblers, toughs, refined businessmen, and fallen women, all mingling in one common herd on the streets. In front of every store or place of business, there was a long hitching rack, and these hitching racks were lined with horses. Thousands of buffalo hides were stacked here and there, and thousands more were loaded onto wagons ready to depart for Fort Worth. Everybody had plenty of money, and half a dozen big stores, 8 or 10 saloons, and 2 or 3 dance halls were doing business at full capacity. From more than a dozen places, music was being ground out on pianos, fiddles, banjos, and guitars. And the whole town was a babble of boisterous talk, whoops, curses, laughter, songs, and miserable music." End of quote. Now, as for Doc, he'd end up getting arrested there at Fort Griffin at least twice in the span of just 1 week. And rather than stick around and face the grand jury, he headed north for Denver. And those were gambling charges, by the way. Apparently, there was some weird law where you couldn't play cards in a saloon. Now, I wasn't able to find out much about Doc's time in Denver, at least not this go around, but he is alleged to have taken a knife to the neck of a fellow gambler. And I say alleged because, other than a few anecdotal stories, there's really no evidence to back it up. Sort of like that swimming hole incident back in Georgia. Doc may have also headed as far north as Cheyenne under the alias of Tom McKee. Once again, not really a lot in the way of evidence, but there was a guy named John C. Thomas who would later recall the following regarding Doc's time in Wyoming. Quote, "Run out of Texas because of his lethal propensities, this platinum blonde desperado tried Colorado, extinguished several gunmen there, came to Cheyenne, and did right well at gambling. The reputation of this dour misanthrope, with death gnawing on his lungs, caused him to be unchallenged here. Jeff Carr, the town marshal, regarded him dourly, but courageous though the big officer was, he didn't choose to take on a killer of Holliday's ruthless character." End of quote. And yeah, maybe, but then again, you gotta keep in mind that Doc still hadn't killed anyone yet by this point, at least not anyone that historians have been able to identify. I'm not saying that Holliday wasn't in Cheyenne. All I'm saying is we really don't know for sure one way or the other. We also don't know what he got up to for pretty much the entirety of 1876. According to some, Doc spent time in Deadwood and St. Louis. Others say he headed back to Texas, where he possibly killed a black soldier over at Jacksboro. And according to his family, Holliday paid a visit to one of his aunts up in Kansas. All we can know for certain is that he was definitely back in Dallas as early as January of 1877. And we know this because he was arrested yet again for gambling. And then 6 months later is when he got shot. Details are sparse. What else is new, right? But supposedly, during the summer of 1877, Holliday stepped inside a saloon over in the town of Breckenridge and delivered an ass whooping to the establishment's owner with a walking cane, an old boy by the name of Henry Kahn. Why? Nobody knows. Doc was arrested and he did pay a fine, but then just as soon as he was released, he headed straight back to the saloon, presumably to finish what he started. Only thing is, Mr. Kahn saw him coming, grabbed a pistol from a customer, and opened fire. We don't know exactly where the bullet struck Holliday or even how badly he was wounded, but it was apparently bad enough for some of the papers to report that he had died. But alas, he survived. And by the following September, he was back in Dallas, where he was once again arrested for gambling. That's also about the time he decided to try his luck back at Fort Griffin. I guess those past charges had already been dropped, and this time, Doc decided to stick around for a while. In fact, it was there at Fort Griffin that he either struck up or rekindled his relationship with Big Nose Kate. Now, if you'll remember earlier, I mentioned how Kate was in St. Louis in 1870, doing pretty much whatever she had to do to get by. She'd be arrested for prostitution in Wichita in 1874, and again in Dodge City the following summer for assault and battery. Of course, by that point, she was already going by the name of Kate Elder. That said, what she got up to between Dodge City and her rendezvous with Doc over in Fort Griffin, I'm not really sure if anyone knows. And speaking of knows, get it? We also don't know how she got the nickname Big Nose Kate. Seems like the answer would be pretty obvious, but then again, there are photos of Kate, and her nose really doesn't appear to be all that large. Hell, to be honest, she's actually not bad looking. A more plausible theory, I'm not really sure where this originates, but I've heard it many, many times. But a more plausible theory is that she got the name on account of always sticking her nose in other people's business. Either way, noses notwithstanding, she and Holliday certainly seemed to hit it off. According to her, Doc was a sharp dresser. He stood 6 feet tall, had fair complexion, blonde hair, blue eyes, a pretty mustache, and a fine set of teeth. She also claimed that he was a, quote, gentleman in manners to the ladies and to everyone. Being quiet, he never hunted for trouble, but if he was crowded, he knew how to take care of himself. Now, once again, this really comes down to who you want to believe. I mean, hell, Bat Masterson painted a completely different picture, saying that Holliday had a, quote, mean disposition and an ungovernable temper, and under the influence of liquor was a most dangerous man. He was hot-headed and impetuous, and very much given to both drinking and quarreling, and among men who did not fear him, he was very much disliked. End of quote, and damn, Bat, why don't you tell us how you really feel? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Masterson probably wasn't all that big of a fan of Doc Holliday. Later on, he'd even claimed that Doc was a weakling who couldn't beat a healthy 15-year-old boy in a go-as-you-please fight. And the only reason he was ever nice to Holliday was on account of their shared friendship with Wyatt Earp. Speaking of Wyatt Earp, as fate would have it, it was right there at Fort Griffin where they first got acquainted. If you've ever seen the movie Wyatt Earp starring Kevin Costner, there's that scene where Doc and Wyatt meet over at Shancy's Saloon. And when Wyatt asked Holliday about the location of a wanted fugitive named Dave Rudaball, Doc responded by saying, Dave Rudaball is an ignorant scoundrel. I disapprove of his very existence. I considered ending it myself on several occasions, but self-control got the better of me. Besides, I'm a sporting man, not a killer. Now, I got no idea whether or not Doc said any of that, or whether he was constantly addressing Wyatt by his full name over and over again in a very annoying fashion, but the rest is pretty damn accurate. Earp really was on the trail of Rudaball, and when he stopped there at the saloon, the proprietor, John Shancy, really did introduce him to Holliday. Now, since we're on the topic of movies, there's another great scene, this one from Tombstone, where Doc got into it with a gambler named Ed Bailey. And that altercation also took place at Fort Griffin, allegedly. According to Wyatt Earp in a 1906 interview, quote, Doc Holliday was spending the evening in a poker game, which was his custom whenever a faro bank did not present superior claims on his attention. On his right sat Ed Bailey, who needs no description because he is soon to drop out of this narrative. The trouble began, as it was related to me afterward, by Ed Bailey monkeying with the dead wood, or what people who live in cities call discards. Doc Holliday admonished him once or twice to play poker, which is your seasoned gambler's method of cautioning a friend to stop cheating. But the misguided Bailey persisted in his furtive attentions to the dead wood. Finally, having detected him again, Holliday pulled down a pot without showing his hand, which he had perfect right to do. Thereupon Bailey started throwing his gun around on Holliday, as might have been expected. But before he could pull the trigger, Doc Holliday jerked a knife and caught Bailey just below the brisket. End of quote. That knife, by the way, was called the Hell Bitch. I'm not making this up. It was actually a gift from a family member back in Georgia. And I don't know for certain that this is the knife that he used on Bailey, but he definitely had a hog sticker called the Hell Bitch. And I, for one, find that awesome. Now, in the movie Tombstone, we see Doc and Kate just sort of hastily making their retreat immediately following the stabbing. In real life, however, Doc was placed under guard by two lawmen in a nearby hotel. Kate, fearing that Doc would be lynched by some of Bailey's friends, then snuck around to the back and set a shed on fire. As soon as everyone was distracted, she busted in with two revolvers, tossing one to Holliday and keeping the other pointed straight at the deputies. They then slowly backed out of the room, hopped on a horse, and hauled ass. Maybe. To quote historian Mark Lee Gardner, Doc and Kate's Fort Griffin escapade is one hell of a story, and it may even be true. In all reality, there are no records of Holliday stabbing anyone at Fort Griffin. According to Big Nose Kate, never even happened. And the only source we have on this, Wyatt Earp, never even claimed to have witnessed it firsthand. Per biographer Gary Roberts, quote, "Given Holliday's peregrinations," how's that for a $5 word, "and Earp's known movements, the Bailey episode could have happened somewhere other than Fort Griffin, someplace like Brackett or Santa Angela, whose records are scarce or non-existent, and whose townships had no newspapers. Much that happened in those camps off the beaten path escaped attention. At any rate, that spring, Doc and Kate headed north to Sweetwater, and from there took the wagon road to Dodge City. Wyatt Earp returned to Dodge in May, and he later said that Doc had already arrived and had settled in by the time he got back. This time, Doc Holliday had left Texas for good. And on that note, I think this is probably about as good a place as any to wrap things up. We're not done yet, though. Join me here next week as we discuss Doc's time in Dodge City, his adventures in New Mexico, and eventually his arrival in Tombstone. And if you're really impatient, the second part of the series is already up on Patreon. Patreon.com/Wild West Extra. Not only do you gain early access for new episodes, but you also have access to the entire back catalog of the Wild West Extravaganza, even the really embarrassing early stuff. It's also ad-free, so you don't have to worry about these pesky commercials. And there's also bonus content. Here lately, I've been narrating the book Frontier Fighter by George W. Coe. And if you're not familiar, George W. Coe, he was involved in the Lincoln County War. He was a good friend with Billy the Kid. If you've ever seen the movie Young Guns 2, remember when they had that shootout with Buckshot Roberts? Well, Coe was there, and he actually got his finger shot off. Dude lived a very long time, and he has a lot of interesting stories to tell. And I think we're already up to chapter 15 or 16 on Patreon. Anyway, you can get all that on patreon.com/Wild West Extra, link down below. You know, I was really hoping to cover Holliday in one or maybe even two separate episodes, but that's not going to happen. I got way too into the research, and by the time it was all said and done, my script was almost 30,000 words. Just to put that in perspective, what you just heard today was only about 5,000 words. So we've got a lot more to cover. This is probably going to end up being at least a 4 and maybe even a 5 episode series, at which point we'll most likely go ahead and start the new series on Wyatt Earp. As for my sources, I lean primarily on 3 different books. Wyatt Earp, The Life Behind the Legend by Casey Teffertiller. Sorry, I stumble over that for some reason. Doc Holliday and Life and Legend by Gary L. Roberts, and Brothers of the Gun by Mark Lee Gardner. I'd especially like to thank Mr. Gardner for putting up with my never-ending questions. Pretty sure by this point he just rolls his eyes every time I send an email. His book, though, Brothers of the Gun, is excellent. It's also brand new, so there's a lot of updated information. I would definitely recommend it to anyone looking for additional information on both Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got. Thank you so much for joining me. Do me a favor, huh? don't go shooting at nobody at a swimming hole, okay? Don't catch tuberculosis, and whatever you do not fall in love with your first cousin. Unless she's just really, really hot, in which case, hey, have at it. All right, till next time, adios.